Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if your sense of self, how you see yourself, might actually be affecting your long-term health and how you age? Well, we've got a fascinating new study diving into just that. This research explores a really interesting idea called the Identity-Vitality-Pathology, or IVP model. Imagine your identity state as a core part of who you are. This study suggests that this identity state isn't just about your personality, it could actually be a key factor in determining your health as you get older. They believe it all starts with how much we identify with our physical bodies versus seeing ourselves in a broader sense. The researchers noticed that while we talk a lot about how our social experiences affect our health, known as the social exposome, we haven't really paid enough attention to how our internal sense of self or our identity plays a role. For example, they point out that sometimes minority groups who face more stressors actually have lower rates of depression than dominant groups. And they think some of this mystery might be unlocked by understanding these unmeasured social psychological processes related to identity. So to explore this, they developed a special tool called the Identity-Vitality-Pathology Scale, or IVPS. This scale is designed to measure this identity state and see how it connects to stress and coping, which in turn influences our health. They want to use this to find new ways to help people age healthier, especially those in different social groups. The core idea behind the IVP model is quite profound. It draws on ideas from contemplative psychology and Eastern philosophy, which suggest that our strong identification with our physical body and our ego can actually be a source of suffering and a distorted view of reality. The researchers argue that this identification with the body as our core self is a social construct, and it is a direct pathway through which stressors from a hierarchical society can shape how we age and impact our health. They've broken down this identity state into three key areas. Think of them as three lenses through which we view ourselves and others. First, there is the universally inclusive vis exclusive self concept, which is about whether you see yourself as part of a large group, including all living things, or if you are more exclusive based on physical traits. Second is the intrinsic versus extrinsic source of value, meaning, do you believe the worth of yourself and others is inherent and unchangeable, or does it depend on external factors like social status? And third is universal compassion, a general sense of kindness and care towards all beings. These three dimensions are thought to work together to influence how we handle stress. Let's look at that first domain, the universally inclusive self-concept. They compare it to concepts like allo-inclusive identity, where you include others in your sense of self, but the IVP model adds a unique twist. It posits that this inclusive identity is most powerful when it is disconnected from identifying solely with your physical body. This disidentification is key for resilience against social identity, the fear of being judged based on your group. If your sense of self is tied only to your body, you are more vulnerable when those aspects are devalued. Now for the second domain, the source of value. IVP theory suggests that an overemphasis on identifying with the physical body can lead us to see worth as dependent on our social standing. This is similar to research on contingent self-worth, where your self-esteem fluctuates based on external validation. But the IVP model specifically links this to our social position in a hierarchical structure. They propose that believing in the intrinsic value of all living beings, including yourself, a belief disconnected from your physical form, can be a powerful strategy to reduce stress and maladaptive coping. And the third domain, universal compassion. Extensive research shows self and other-directed compassion are crucial for well-being. The IVP model builds on this by connecting compassion directly to that core identity state, and importantly suggesting that its health benefits expand when it includes non-human beings. They highlight that it is not just about acting kindly, but the origin of that kindness, rooted in a broader understanding of self. The theory positions these identity states on a spectrum. On one end, you have identity pathology, where identifying strongly with the physical body and social hierarchy leads to increased stress, reactivity, accelerated aging, and disease. On the other end is identity vitality, where a universally inclusive self. Concept belief in intrinsic worth and universal compassion promote health buffers, stress, and maintains physiological balance. This identity vitality is linked to hallmarks of aging, suggesting a clear biological pathway for how identity can influence healthy longevity. So how did they test this? First, they developed the IVPS scale by gathering insights from focus groups and interviews with a diverse group of adults. Then they collected data from two main samples. The first was with 310 black and white adults aged 18 to 81. This was to get an initial look at how the scale worked. The second study was much larger with over 2,000 black and white adults from different regions of the US. This larger sample helped confirm their findings and examine the scale's properties more robustly. They also included other established measures like the life orientation test for optimism and the social dominance orientation scale to see if their new IVPS scale measured something related but distinct. They used statistical tools like exploratory and confirmatory factor analysis. Think of factor analysis as a way to see if the questions on the IVPs really measure the underlying ideas they're supposed to. They also checked if the data was good enough for these analyses using something called the Kaiser-Meyer-Oken measure, a kind of is this data good enough test. A high score meant yes, the data was ready for analysis. Interestingly, in one of the studies they found evidence that the scale might be measuring one core underlying idea, a unidimensional construct, even though their theory suggested 3 dimensions. The first factor explained a huge chunk of the variance, meaning a lot of the items were pointing to the same central concept. They also developed a shorter 12-item version of the scale, the IVPS short, which is super useful for researchers who have limited time or resources. Now, for the really important part, the results. They looked at how the IVPS scores related to other psychological traits. They found that higher scores on both the long and short IVPS scales were consistently linked with higher levels of optimism and resilience. This makes sense because people with a more vitalized identity state likely have more positive outlooks and coping skills. Crucially, they found that higher IVPS scores were negatively correlated with social dominance orientation, or SDUEs. Do is basically a measure of how much someone believes in social hierarchies, and that some groups are naturally superior to others. This finding supports the idea that a vitalized identity state which emphasizes universal worth and compassion is indeed opposed to the endorsement of social hierarchies. The p-value of less than 0.01 here is like a fluke. Ometer reading really low, meaning there is a very small chance this negative correlation, with 0 is just random chance. In their discussion, the authors emphasized that the IVPS scales, especially the 20-item and 12-item versions, show strong psychometric properties. This means they are reliable and valid measures of the identity state they aim to capture. They found consistent results across 2 large samples of black and white adults, giving confidence in the scale's utility. When it came to the factor structure, the results were a little mixed. Study 1 suggested a 3-dimensional structure best represented the data, but Study 2, with its larger sample, strongly supported a unidimensional structure, meaning all the items were measuring one overarching concept. They lean towards recommending the unidimensional interpretation, reasoning that the items in their hypothesized dimensions might all stem from that single latent construct. They also note that the items related to universal compassion loaded distinctly, which they interpret as support for the IVPS's unique ability to capture compassion rooted in this identification with the physical body rather than other motivations. This is a key theoretical point. The construct validity findings were pretty clear. The IVPS consistently correlated positively with optimism and resilience as expected. This indicates that a more vitalized identity state, as measured by the IVPS, is indeed associated with psychological traits that promote well-being. And the negative correlation with SDO, which is the measure of preference for social hierarchies, further reinforces that the IVPS isn't just measuring a general positive outlook, but specifically something that counters hierarchical thinking. Looking ahead, the authors see a lot of potential for the IVPS. They believe making these scales available will allow researchers across many fields to better understand how identity influences health and stress. They're already planning to integrate the IVPS into studies looking at things like loneliness and even long-term health outcomes like cardiovascular health in large cohort studies like MESA. This shows they see it as a practical tool for intervention in public health. Of course, every study has its limitations. A big one here is that the initial samples were made up of us born non-Hispanic black and white adults. This means we need to be cautious about generalizing these findings too broadly to other ethnic groups or people from different cultural backgrounds. They acknowledge that more research is needed on diverse populations to confirm the scale's universality. They suggest future research should definitely broaden this assessment to include more diverse populations and different geographic locations to really test how invariant the scale is across different people. They also mentioned the need for further psychometric evaluation, perhaps, using more advanced statistical modeling and some qualitative research to truly capture the depth of the theory. So to wrap it all up, this study gives us a promising new tool, the IVPS. It has initial evidence of being a valid and reliable measure of identity state. This construct is hypothesized to be a critical modifiable factor that can buffer the negative health impacts of life stressors and promote healthier aging. This is really exciting because it opens doors for understanding how our inner world, how we conceptualize ourselves, our values, and our compassion can significantly shape our physical health and longevity. The idea that we can actively cultivate a more vitalized identity for better health is pretty powerful. What do you think about this idea that your identity state could be so important for your health? Does it make sense to you that seeing yourself as part of a larger whole with inherent worth and compassion for all could be protective against stress? I found the link between identifying with your physical body and a susceptibility to social hierarchies particularly thought-provoking. It makes you consider how much of our stress response is tied to our ego and our social standing. While the study did a great job validating the scale in Black and white adults, the call for more research on diverse ethnic and cultural groups is super important. Psychology research often struggles with true global generalizability, so that is a key area for future work. I am also curious to see how interventions designed to shift identity states might actually work in practice. If we can teach people to foster a more inclusive self-concept and universal compassion, could it genuinely lead to better aging and fewer health disparities? That is the big question, and hopefully future studies using the IVPS will help answer it. If you found this breakdown interesting, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Rubin's Mind Lab for more explorations into the fascinating world of psychology. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.